like to welcome you all back to Coaching Conversations with Patrice and Liz. And again, I want to welcome Mara Haight, our licensed clinical mental health counselor, who will continue to give us insight as she takes us deeper and deeper into our topic. So I'm really excited to have Liz and be with Liz and Mara and flesh out some of these topics that we have for you today. This is the second in a series of 6 conversations, our first being the introduction on trauma. This is where we introduce the family that we will be following and weaving them through and into our topic of our conversations about trauma. And today we'll be delving into today's topic using our composite family as we talk about attachment and developmental trauma. And if you haven't seen our first pod yet, I'd like to guide you to the Coaching Conversations with Patrice and Liz folder to access the pods, the bios, and any other information that goes along with the information that we have been presenting to you. Our goals and what we want to make sure that you understand that this is a continuation and will be a continuation of all the trainings that we have been having and that we want to continue to have. And we want to have this as a tool for new hires and just anyone who needs to just reflect on the work that we're doing and that they're doing. And then we want to teach those working with families how to recognize, how to name, and to heal from their trauma. We want to teach professionals how to have a deeper and more introspective conversation about their own baggage that they carry and how the people that they work with consequently carry the burden until they get professional help, until it's been addressed. And that's important. And then we want to introduce the pauses that will be incorporated into the video. We want you to pause and really reflect on what the conversations have been in your groups by yourself and think through and talk about how this impacts you and the work that you're doing. And then we just want you to enjoy what we're doing. Now let's go to Liz as she reminds us of what we talked about in our last podcast. Back to you, Liz.
So like Patrice had mentioned, we really encourage you to go to the resource list. You can pull up the case study family, really review some of the details we shared about them in the first episode. That way, if you're just joining us, you can still get whatever you need out of this episode. We do want to mention that whether you're returning or you're just joining us, we are talking about a family with significant amounts of trauma, various different forms of trauma. There's various ages and relationships involved, and there is a significant amount of physical violence, both self-perpetrated, and then we do have a few different perpetrators related to the family that we talk about, and all this can be very triggering. It can be hard to process. And maybe you don't sit down and join us for the whole episode. Maybe you come back, maybe you pause where you need to, and maybe you don't come back, but you take from it what you can. And that's fine. So either watching the first episode or just reviewing the resources will give you a glimpse and more of a heads up of some of the things that may kind of strike home for you. In the first one, we talked a lot about some of the gendered dynamics going on in this family. We really fleshed out also the family dynamics between these individuals. And then we really brought that all together under some power dynamics. What does it look like if you are an FA that just walked into a trauma situation like the one we described? What does it look like just being an FA with a family and the systemic and inherent power structure that's within that relationship? So we really fleshed that out and some of just our overall reactions to the family, and really outlined, the goals for the series, and also just for episode by episode. So Mara is actually going to give us a deeper look into what some of the goals for this episode is.
Yeah, so in our last conversation, we got to know this family through the lens of, trauma, right? They're experiencing trauma. What does that mean? Define those terms and apply it to the family. And we're going to continue to do that today with a more narrow lens. So today we're going to look specifically at developmental trauma, or trauma that happens during the critical stages of brain development. We're going to talk about how that's different in some important ways from trauma that happens when our brain has fully developed. And then we're going to talk specifically about attachment trauma, which is a form of developmental trauma. It's really what happens when the people we're trusting to take care of us, our parents, our caregivers, are the sources of trauma and pain. So we're gonna dive into that today as we continue to follow this family and apply what we're learning to what's happening for them.
So if any of the stuff that we've brought up sounds too vague, this is a really good time to pause this episode, go back to the first one, look at anything that you need, or even just sit with your small groups or yourself and kind of review the things that came up for you last time, where you're hoping to explore with us and the family this time, and what your focus is for this. So this would be a good time to go ahead and pause and then join us again when you're ready. But while other people pause, we're going to keep going. So the first thing maybe that we need to look at, and Mara, maybe you can help guide us with how we start diving into such a big conversation about attachment and developmental trauma.
Yeah. Well, the question, the broad question is, what are some of the attachment trauma dynamics, the developmental trauma dynamics that are showing up for this family? And so just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, first I want to say with every one of these conversations, there is a little handout. So I have mine right here, and we may bring it up on the screen at some point, we may not, but everyone should pull that up so that they have that as a guide, because we're going to throw some terms out, and those terms are defined on the handout. But specifically, want to hear, from both of you and for the three of us to talk about what are some of the developmental trauma dynamics that we're seeing show up here, and what are some of the attachment trauma dynamics. And when we talk about that, we're talking about how is the development for kiddo, the youngest in the family, Anthony, who is for the FA, the focus, right? He's the kid that's enrolled in the program, and he is right there in the middle of the most critical stages of brain development. He's 2 years old, right? And what we know is that when you're 2 years old, you're totally dependent on your family. You're totally dependent on the family system to take care of you, right? To feed you, to provide a roof over your head. And it can be really disruptive and confusing to be living in a traumatic environment at that age, right? Because you're not able to establish a safe ground in which to grow, right? So what do you all see? What are some of the dynamics that feel important as we talk about developmental trauma and attachment trauma with this family?
Patrice, do you want to start us?
Yeah. I just feel like the disruptive part is important and confusing, especially we know that kids don't have the language always to know how to verbalize or articulate their needs. And we say that behavior has meaning, but we don't always attach what that meaning is to the behavior, because we think little kids have no reason to be upset. Little children have really. So I think that's what comes up for me in this conversation.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's something I hear all the time. That's such a common misconception from parents, from people in general, is that, they were too young to understand. They were too young to be impacted, right? They don't know what's going on. And it's actually quite the opposite. I mean, if you can put yourself in Anthony's shoes, here he is totally dependent on Agnes and his older siblings to find some sense of internal safety. He has no context for what's going on. He's learning about himself. He's learning about the world through them. They are his world, right? And so when something scary, like what we talked about last time, when you're looking at your older sibling and they're self-harming and they're bleeding and people are yelling and the environment feels scary, that's pretty terrorizing for a child. And what are they learning? What are they imprinting through that experience that they're then going to carry with them throughout their life, right?
Yeah.
So that's so important to recognize that, like, no, we're never too young. We're constantly learning. And when we see, we read over and understand what's happening with Anthony, there's some pretty clear signs that he's being impacted, right? We're not seeing him hit the regular milestones that we would imagine he would be hitting. He's not verbal. He's not, there are some pretty clear signs that he is in fact impacted by what's going on.
Yeah, nonverbal, and the doctor can't, they've already ruled out any sort of biological or physical explanation for why he's nonverbal, right? And even the differences that we talked about between how Anthony interacts with his FA and how he interacts with mom. The developmental skills he can do with FA and the concentration he can have with the FA compared to when mom or mom's boyfriend try to step in and take over and, model the skill is not the same. So there's that clear disconnect for even someone who is only 2 years old.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that we try to talk about with VFAs and coaching with family advocates is coaching is to remember, such as say, for instance, there's domestic abuse in this family and the parent says, well, this just happened to me. I can't understand why they're acting like this behavior is going on with them because it happened with me. But as we've said, it happens to everyone. It impacts everyone. And as we're looking at this, we need to also not only take care of the parent, but bring them back into bringing the child back in the circle and helping them recognize that when it happened to you, it also happened to them. And then I think we need to look at the end in mind, in that if we are feeling or saying to ourselves that this didn't happen to them, then we can't acknowledge any feelings that they've had as a result of this. And when it isn't taken care of now, then we don't need to wonder why, as an adult, you're married to someone who's been into that and they can't understand. They have no ability to communicate with you. They don't have any understanding of their behavior on you, because back when no one helped them to connect how they felt to any of this. So I think it follows us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we see that in the siblings too, because we have some good variation in the ages. So we have from 2 to 16, and we see our 2-year-old, where we're talking about, we see a 6-year-old who behaviorally really cannot connect to structure. We see a lot of, those love-seeking behaviors, and he gets a lot of one-on-one with mom because of some of the things that are out of his control. And then some of the behaviors he does. We see Candace at 11, and she's who we're witnessing through her trauma. We see her cutting. We see that sort of self-internalized and self-inflicted pain and trauma and how that can look. And then we see 16, who is completely shut down, completely reserved, really only steps out when inappropriately he has to be, the male adult in the home and moderate and control other adults. So we see, Patrice, what you're talking about in this family. Unfortunately, we see that lineage, we see that play out, and can see that with the older kids, they were never brought back into the circle. And this is what it looks like when you're not.
And one of the things I really like to keep in mind is that these are accommodations, right, that we make on a biological level, a neurobiological level, to get our basic needs met, right? So our brain's primary function is to keep us safe, right? And to help us find pleasure, avoid pain, right? Pretty simple. And so for a 2-year-old, what does that look like? Trying to, get fed, get love, get some attention, affection, feel, get to explore the world and learn about who I am. And those needs continue throughout our lifetime. And we can see a pattern in this family of an accommodation, adaptation that had to be made to get these really normal needs met, right? So for me, it's really important to normalize, like, even though some of these behaviors, like the self-harming or like tantruming, acting out, can feel frustrating and can often just be seen as like behavioral issues that need to be fixed, if we can understand it from a trauma-informed perspective, we can recognize these are attempts to get a need met, right? And when the environment doesn't have healthy boundaries, healthy communication, when the system isn't healthy, then of course we're going to make adaptations to that system that aren't healthy, right? That in the long run may not serve us, but within the family system, they are serving us in some way. So I'm always curious as I'm looking through all these, Jeremiah and Candace and Quinn and Anthony, and the quote unquote issues that we're seeing with them, how are these attempts to cope and function within this environment, right? And all the way up through, understanding Agnes and Myrtle and Jorge and Jared and Gregory, all of these people are likely doing the best they can with the skills and tools they have, right? And so that's what feels really important to me about a trauma-informed perspective, is that we're always understanding that when distressing, overwhelming things happen that are a threat to our safety or a threat to our ability to get our needs met, we make accommodations, we make adaptations that later in life may not serve us, but made sense at the time, right? So always being curious about what is the function of this behavior? Does it make sense if we look at it from a trauma-informed perspective, right?
Right. Well, even with that, Mara, if you're self-harming, maybe it's their way when that actual act happens and everybody comes around you and gathers around. Is this how I have to get my attention? So in a way, as you say, it may not be what you're consciously thinking. Oh, I'll cut myself, or I'll do this, or I'll do that to get attention. But when that happens, then everyone comes. You get that attention. So even in a negative way, it gets the job done. It gets done what you need. And it's not the best way to do it. But sometimes you find in families that don't function properly or don't function right or normally, that's how you get it.
And it is the best way in that family. That's the part, that's the piece for me. It's like, if I'm Anthony and I'm witnessing this and I'm knowing that it's really hard for me to get the attention and affection and space that I need to grow, right? I mean, we're seeing these delays, and we know that mom has had mental health issues, and we can imagine that it's often probably experience of, I can't seem to get my needs met, I can't seem to get the attention, affection that I need. And I'm witnessing a lot of attention going to my sibling when they hurt themselves. And so I'm taking all that information in, right? It's my brain's job to try to make sense of, how do we get this need met, right? And so in that family system, that is what works. And that's the tricky part, is that, it can seem weird to an outside person, and we might say that's so dysfunctional, or they're attention seeking. Well, of course, we're all attention seeking. We need attention from others to grow and develop, right? So that's normal. And we're observing from the time we're born our family system and saying, what works here? And if me communicating my needs calmly, if me crying doesn't get me what I need, I'm going to stop doing that and I'm going to start doing something else. So maybe I'm going to start biting, because crying doesn't work, but biting does work, right? So, you know, I just really try to normalize, yes, in the world outside of this family, these things are going to become an issue, right? When I go to school and I'm biting, it's then all of a sudden, this isn't okay. But it did work, and it was the best way in my family. And I'm always trying to hold compassion for that, and also recognize that we're only going to be able to affect any kind of behavior change by first understanding and validating the need, right?
Right.
And starting from there.
Right.
And you both make a really good point of when you're trying to get your needs met, one of the kiddos' way of doing it could create a completely different way that another kiddo sees it and internalizes it. So for Candace, if that, you know, for all we know, she does not want attention. In her bio, we learned that she didn't get her dad's last name. She feels very outcasted. You know, maybe, you know, her form of attachment is she's just fully pulled away from her family. She is already just on the straight and narrow, very independent, you know, not reliant at all. So for her, for all we know, the cutting is about control. It's about having something in your life that you can control, that someone can't take from you, that someone can't restrict from you. But then we have Anthony, our 2-year-old, who's like, attention, I would love to get a bottle. I'm gonna scream, I'm gonna bite. And so even though the goals of these behaviors aren't the same, they're creating these same type of responses of getting the needs met. But it makes it even more complicated because, you know, it's the same formula, except it's always a different answer. And there's no way to predict who's going to internalize what and how.
You make me think of sorry.
No, go ahead, Patrice.
It makes me think of a book, and at this time I can't think of the name, but one thing that stood out from this book is it said, from every family you take out something. Every child acts out something from the family. So if it's dysfunctional behavior, that's what you play out. And like you said, Liz, it might look different from each child in the family, but each one takes a little piece of it and acts that out. And then as you walk out from that family, that person, what they've taken and how they act as a result of what they got from that family, when they bring in other people. So like they bring in someone to be in their life, their partner, whoever that might be, that partner either chooses to walk into that and function within that new system that child has walked out of it with, or if they can't, then they leave. So everybody brings something out of that family that fits into who they are, their personality, and who they've become in that family. So it's kind of interesting what you're saying. I see that.
And you know, I think that point that there isn't like this predictor that we can say, oh, this is exactly what this behavior means. But if we sort of central to a trauma-informed understanding is, instead of asking what's wrong with you, we ask what happened to you.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
If we're always coming with this like compassionate curiosity, okay, so, you know, you're self-harming. Tell me about what's the unmet need, or I imagine that this is doing something for you. It's helping in some way. Tell me about that. Help me understand that, right? Even for the nonverbal kiddos, trying to understand what might the need be, what's the context in which this behavior is happening, and what might the unmet needs be, right? So we are all pretty predictable in that we have some pretty similar needs, and the ways we go about trying to get those needs met are going to be really individual, right? So I think always remembering, we've got to be pretty curious. We've got to not assume that we know why someone is doing what they're doing, but do assume that it makes sense in their context, right? that if we can suspend our biases and our judgment and be aware of what we might think is the reason, right? And set that aside and be curious in a really compassionate way about what's happening for them, then we can get to know that, right? We can get to understand that. I know that we need to probably move a bit into a more formal understanding of what developmental trauma is. I wonder if we want to kind of transition at this point.
That sounds great, Mara. Let me just say one thing as we move in transition. I think the point that you said, not asking what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, is absolutely valid. And I think that also, as a family advocate, as a home visitor, as someone who works with kids in daycare centers, we have a tendency to say maybe, what's wrong with me? Why am I not getting some change out of this child? Why are they still acting this way? What's wrong with me? Instead of going back to not even what's wrong with me or what's wrong with you, but really, I think that's the crux of all of this, is what has happened to you, because we don't pathologize that person,
Right.
or ourselves even. And so I think that's good. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we go further into what are some of the other concepts people need to understand. So if you can take us into whatever other education you have on this and help us dive deeper, we're ready for it.
Great. Well, on this first page of the handout, there's this quote here that I want to read because it really captures, I think, the difference between developmental trauma and trauma that happens after the brain has developed. So it's from a book called Nurturing Resilience, which is specifically about helping people heal from developmental trauma. And it says, with developmental trauma, the table was not properly leveled or was built without much attention or craftsmanship. And therefore, everything resting on the table is unlikely to have the support that it needs. So when we think about, a lot of times the goal of an FA is to go in and probably teach some skills, right? And if we're trying to place those tools on a table, and if the table isn't stable, everything's going to keep rolling off, right? Mm-hmm. And it can feel really frustrating. Like, we've already gone over this. I've given you everything you need, and you don't seem to have any retention, right? You're not able to grasp what we're talking about. You're not changing behavior. And so with developmental trauma, we really need to understand this bottom-up approach, right? We may have to do a lot of work in helping people stabilize or rebuild, bring new attention to that, just the base sort of functions of being human, right? What are my needs? How do I get them met? How do I regulate my emotions properly, right? How do I learn to self-soothe? A lot of these things are precursors to learning anything else. And that's the disruption that we see with developmental trauma, right? With someone who had a really safe, healthy life, they had lots of skills for self-soothing and coping growing up, and then something really terrible happens to them as an adult. They have this nice, well-built table that they get to come back to and work through the trauma on, right? When we don't have that, when we think about, any of these kiddos really in this family, they're building this table, they're patchworking together this table that says, okay, if I have a need for, if I need to express my feelings, how do I do that, right? Well, I'm learning when I feel any kind of sadness, when I feel any kind of anger, hurt, or whatever, I have to express it in this really explosive way, right? I don't learn to self-soothe, self-regulate. And so now, as I'm growing older, I don't know how to get my needs met properly, right? I don't know how to build relationship with people. So on the second page, the side bar here talks about the impact of developmental trauma from some literature from Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the experts in the field. Really what we see is that trauma that happens during critical brain development impacts every aspect of our lives, basically, right? It impacts our relationships. We have trouble building healthy relationships. We have trouble with boundaries, right? Because we weren't taught and modeled how to sit and receive boundaries. Empathy, we often are very isolated. We see issues with physical health. So we see issues with development, sensory motor development. We're seeing that with Anthony, coordination problems, lots of other medical issues, and often somatic symptoms as well, right? So we see psychological symptoms showing up in the body. And it's important to recognize that we have this sort of separation of mind and body in our culture that's like, that's happening in their head, right? But the reality is when you grow up in chronic stress, the neurochemicals and the way that you're being flooded with stress chemicals all of the time, your brain actually makes accommodations to that as it grows. So research has shown that just baseline levels of cortisol in someone that has grown up in chronic stress or has had a lot of exposure to developmental trauma, their baseline levels are different than the average person. So either they may have a really low baseline level, so they have a hard time detecting stress or things in the environment that are bad for them. That may end up showing up as I get into relationships that aren't healthy for me. I ignore red flags, right? I don't perceive threats the way that everyone else does because my baseline is lower, right? Or it may show up as a really high baseline and a lot of reactivity, right? Then I'm extra sensitive to threats in my environment. So then I might seem like, we see reference that Myrtle is getting frustrated with, or Myrtle and Agnes are getting frustrated with each other. They're both very reactive. We can probably understand that as some signs of developmental trauma, right? That they may just have a higher sensitivity to stress, to noise, to frustrations, right? And this is a neurochemical issue. This is not just a behavioral issue. So it's really important to understand that with developmental trauma, the whole brain is developing within a traumatic environment and is making changes and accommodations to try to meet, your brain is assuming this is what the world is like for this person. So we've got to make some changes to make it work, right? Because the only thing our brain really cares about during that time is how are we going to keep this organism safe, right? How are we going to keep this organism safe? So, these changes that are happening during brain development are then going to hang around, unfortunately, right? And we're going to see across the lifespan all of these issues. So we also see mental and emotional issues, lots of issues with emotion regulation, meaning I feel an emotion and I don't know what to do with it, right? Because we're learning in contexts in our early childhood, our parent caregiver is usually teaching us, when you feel sad, what do you do with that? When you feel angry, what do you do with that? When you have any kind of need or emotional need or physical need, what do you do with that? So we see a lot of dysregulation with that when that table hasn't properly been built. We see dissociation. So this experience of I disconnect from my body, I disconnect from my feelings, because the ways that we're supposed to react, which is I feel something and I use it to communicate, gets ignored, right? So I start to ignore the cues because they're meaningless in this environment, right? We see cognitive issues, so issues with processing new information. A lot of that has to do with this constant stress response, right? It's really hard to retain information, to do new learning when we're in a chronic stress response. And then, as you could predict, this is going to lead to some issues in like daily living and self-care, right? So lots of issues with how I view myself, how I view the world, my self-esteem, issues with behaviors, right? Because I don't have a lot of good self-regulation and self-soothing skills. So we basically see with developmental trauma that every area of our life gets disrupted, right? Mm-hmm. And as we're working with these kiddos to try to intervene early on, there's a lot of opportunity to try to create and teach good parenting and self-soothing, but we also need to recognize that we're often working with parents whose brains developed within these environments of chronic stress, right? So really look at and understand this handout. The third page talks about Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACEs study, which I think people have probably heard of, which really helped us make a lot of these connections. That study really helped us to start to see that a lot of the indicators in adulthood that doctors were treating were linking back to childhood trauma. So we may have some time to get more into that, but it really wants people to understand this difference, that the brain develops within that traumatic environment, and the adaptations that are made create lifelong impacts, right? And we have to be able to work with that. So yeah, interested to hear reactions from you all or anything that you might add to that as we go through this.
Wow.
I think, go ahead, Patrice.
No, I'm just saying, wow, you gave us a lot to really contemplate. What were you going to say, Liz?
Yes, Patrice, and it can feel overwhelming, and especially if you're the FA in this situation, it can feel overwhelming. And I think, Mara, everything you just gave us is so great, because that's the point. Let's get overwhelmed in these spaces, in these conversations with each other, rather than when we show up at the doorstep of our families. And I think for me, when I think about, the ACEs study, and then a lot of what you were talking about, Mara, it's, I really see in my head, and when I'm trying to explain it to people, that developmental trauma is like a really old oak, like the roots just look insane. So in this family, we have grandma who gets, very irritated, has a different view of discipline than her daughter Myrtle. But grandma also had Myrtle at 16, as where mom had her first kid at 26, so, and some of those responses that you were talking about with the lower cortisol, Mara, we see, toxic relationships, we see less response to red flags and to abuse. And mom has this history of abusive husbands. The boyfriend, from what we know, seems to be a little bit of change of pace, but she doesn't care about him, so there's not that same emotional connection to him, because safety and stereotypical healthy is just as threatening, as where mom's like, I don't see red flags, this has been my life. So we are seeing developmentally this trickle down, and how this one root of grandma had mom at 16 and was a teenage mom, there's all of the intricacies and hardships that come with that. And those are just roots off grandma, though, because then, grandma had a baby who has her own roots, her own spread off, and it goes through each kid, and it changes, and it doesn't just go away. Developmental trauma doesn't just, grow itself away. It stays in a lifeline until something's done with it.
Well, and you also, when you said something about you shouldn't ask what's wrong with you, because maybe I don't know that anything's wrong with me. Like Liz was saying, this has just been what I've known all my life. I saw this happening with this person and this person and this person. And sometimes you don't make a move to try to rectify it, or even see that anything is wrong, until what you've gone through far exceeds what you have been used to. Right. Then it kind of takes you out of your zone, and you think, maybe something's wrong here. But this is just, you look at it for a minute, and then you keep moving on, because it is still what you're used to. It's like taking itself to a different level, and you might think twice about it, but you just keep going on. And if you don't know anything different, like we say, you can change a behavior and tell someone to stop doing this, but if they don't see it as being different, they just see you as coming in and you think you're better than me, or you haven't given me something different to change to. And maybe at this time, I don't see a problem with what I'm doing. It's like discipline. We talk to people about, okay, you can't spank them like you used to. Well, that's how everybody's done it in my neighborhood and how I've seen it and this and that. But what else do you have better to offer me?
Right.
So it's hard. You're going against culture, and that's a big thing. You're going against a lot of different factors, and this is what I've seen all my life. My parents were in prison. All kinds of things, like you mentioned with the ACEs. This is just who I am. This is just what I know. And then if I try to change, my family might reject me. Do I want to be without my family? So there's a lot of areas that we're talking about.
Right. And it's not just our family's developmental trauma, right? If you have an FA who's never seen this type of trauma, this just looks, just mind blowing.
Right.
Then if it's what you're saying, Patrice, if you don't know any different, you can't do any different. And that means that it can be hard to validate any different and not pathologize any different. And that's, and that can be where an FA really needs to realize that how they walk into a home, whether they see it or not, the first time you judge this, the first time you give that a funny look, the first time you close your body language when mom tells you how many husbands she's had, all of that is going to be where you need to recognize your own development. And maybe you didn't have developmental trauma, but your development cannot blind you from someone else's developmental trauma, especially when you're going into their home.
Or trauma at that level.
Mm-hmm.
We probably all have some kind of trauma, but trauma at that level. And you can close the door. They will close the door to you if you come in with that kind of judgment. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Mara?
You both were talking and like touching on this idea of like learning better. I think one of the important pieces to remember is that new learning does require safety, right? If we are consistently in our survival brain, right? If we are constantly in an environment of high stress, we are going to keep relying on the things that have worked in the past. It doesn't matter if they're not working anymore, right? It's like if I suddenly want to tell both of you that fire is not an issue, it's not unsafe, right? Don't worry about it. It's just a construct that you've learned in your life. It's not true anymore. That don't be afraid of fire, don't be afraid of smoke, don't be afraid of flames. Right? Well, that's all well and good while you're safe, but as soon as you smell smoke, you're going to run. You're not going to go, well, Mara told me.
Mara was real sure.
Yeah. The research is bearing out that that's probably fine, right? That I'm not going to be in danger. So it's one thing to introduce new concepts, and that's helpful. But we also need to, people need to have safe enough environments that they can practice new things and have enough access to resources and stability that they can make those changes. And so this is where, it can feel really privileged for an advocate to come in your house and tell you how you should do differently. Yeah. And you are, I was working with one of the FAs who's like got a parent with 3 young kids at home, and there's constant screaming, and she's like, I'm like trying to help her learn these breathing exercises, and there's just chaos in the background. And I'm like, I don't even know where to start, right? And there's no one to help. And so it's also sometimes slowing down and recognizing that they might be doing the best they can in their context, and we probably wouldn't be able to do any different, right? Like it's really challenging within a context of unsafe and chaos to make change. And so we kind of find this dilemma a lot of the time that we bump up against, and we may have to start really basic, like what are some of the barriers to safety? Right? What are some of the, as I'm suggesting these things and this person clearly is not taking my suggestions, if I don't assume that they're just being difficult, right? Assume that there is some reason that they're unable to do things differently, right? And that reason may make a lot of sense, and you've got to meet them there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Mara, what you're saying really does lead very well into more of the attachment theory and some of the attachment trauma going on with this family. Mm-hmm. So right now would be a great time. Go ahead and pause, reference some of the discussion and guiding questions that we have for you in your resources, and go through that, because it's important to really talk through that, to see just how powerful and impactful the attachments in this family and their relationships are, and to really understand the stuff that Mara is going to help us walk through for this next part of this episode.
Yeah, well, shall we get into that? Shall we talk about the so same thing, second page, you've got the impact of developmental trauma on this side, and then on this other side you have the impact of attachment trauma. So again, attachment trauma is a type of developmental trauma, but it's probably one of the most complex forms of developmental trauma, because if we have a safe home base in another human as a child, we can get through quite a bit, right? So this is why we might see some people who have been through, they've been through, maybe they immigrated from a country where there was war and there were all kinds of traumatic things happening. But if they had a really safe, consistent attachment figure who helped them weather all of that, they might have some pretty good outcomes. You might not see a lot of these indicators of developmental trauma because they had that safety of another human helping them get through it. When we don't have that, when we have what we call attachment trauma, the normal bonding process with our attachment caregiver, our primary caregiver, is disrupted in some way. And this can be through intentional disruption, like abuse, right? Or it could be through just a lack of presence, right? Or I think about these children who were separated from their families at the border, and the attachment trauma that we are going to see with that. And that was nobody's. I mean, that wasn't nobody's fault. That there were people at fault, but it wasn't parents' fault, and it wasn't child's fault, right? They were separated during critical attachment phases, and that not having that safe human that you're orienting to help you navigate the world, having an absence of that, or even worse, having that human that you biologically need to bond to survive be the source of your pain, is incredibly disruptive, right? So we often talk about this biological catch-22 that kiddos who are being abused by a caregiver have, because there's all these hormones that make us want to attach, right? Make parent and child want to attach to each other. That are, it's why everyone thinks their kid is the best and the cutest, because like biologically we need to attach, right? That's how we stay safe. We cannot abandon our child, and child can't abandon parents. However, if that same parent is also the source of pain, and you are getting flooded with stress chemicals whenever they're around, because I need them, I want them, and they hurt me, right? We create this biological catch-22, and the long-term impact of that is incredibly dysregulating for people, right? We often see that there is just an inability to consistently cue their caregiver for what they need, right? So you might see kids who never cry, never ask for anything. Usually that's the case if you have a caregiver who's just absent, right? So child does the natural things that children do to try to cue their attachment figure to meet their needs. If it doesn't work, they shut that down, right? Earlier, Liz was talking about Quinn and this experience of detaching from your family, right? Like, I want nothing, I don't need anything from you. We often see that when there is a lack of safe attachment, right? We become avoidant of even asking for anything, and we actually can become really overwhelmed and dysregulated when we get any love or attention, right? Because we've learned not to want it, and we've learned that it's bad to want it, right? So when we feel any desire for love, connection, it's coupled with, that's bad, you shouldn't want that, right? We also sometimes see that when there's inconsistencies, right? When sometimes parent shows up, sometimes they don't, and we can't figure out as a child, what behaviors am I doing that cue them to come and what is pushing them away, right? We see a lot of inconsistencies, right? We might see a lot of behaviors that we think, wow, this is so erratic, right? They might be really, really needy, right? All of the time. And like they can't be satiated, right? Like there's never enough, because there's this constant anxiety and fear that that might go away, right? I don't have any sense for what I do to control this. I don't have any sense that like, oh, when I do this, I'll get this. So when I'm getting it, I'm really clinging and attached to it, right? I don't want to let it go. And I'm scared constantly that it's going to go away, right? So we see a lot of these things show up as behavioral issues, right? We see a lot of these, either, you know, we can see on one end of the spectrum, the really good kid, right? That's like never has any complaints, never has any needs. They're perfect all the time, but they're managing a lot of anxiety, right? And are having a hard time getting their needs met because they haven't learned how. We often see that in adulthood showing up as like overworking and not having any boundaries and never knowing how to like set limits, right? So I know I've talked to a lot of our FAs that struggle with that, right? That have that show up for them. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, we can see a lot of like really explosive behaviors, a lot of like anxiety and being really forceful about trying to get your needs met, because there's this panic that no one's going to listen to me. I'm never going to be, you know, I have to be really big and loud to try to get my needs met. So important to understand that biological dilemma, right, at the end of the day, and that this follows us into adulthood. So on that same handout, we talk about how this shows up in adults, and we can see this with Agnes and with Myrtle and with Jorge, with all of the adults in this family. We see some whispers of some attachment trauma, right? Because there's, you know, detachment, withdrawing from connections, and inability to have really like healthy, good romantic relationships, right? Inability to show connection, control issues, anger issues, impulsivity, lots of distrust of others, right? And one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind for me as a therapist, and I think for all of us as advocates and human service workers, is when you are working with someone who has been put in this biological catch-22, and you show love, care, and warmth, that can feel overwhelming and threatening. Yep. And so you may be like, I thought things were going so well, and then I got pushed away. I got pushed out, right? Often this triggers for people, I can't trust this person. In my experience, that's not safe. Letting people in, getting attached to them, needing them is what happens before I get hurt, right? And so it can look really weird if you don't understand that context, and you might be like, what the heck happened, right? Like, what did I do wrong? Why are they pushing away this help, but they seem to keep running to people that are really toxic and mean, right? Well, when we understand what's happened to them, we can understand that we might be triggering that panic response. We might be triggering a trauma response even by just being loving and caring, right? So really important to understand that when our primary caregivers are the source of our trauma, either intentionally or unintentionally, we see a whole host of disruptions that often are going to show up in a relationship between the FA and the parent, right? Imagine you all have seen that.
Yeah, I think that what you have just said to us has probably been as far, because I was an FA for many, many years, and what you say resonates. And honestly, I believe that this is probably one of the most important parts of this conversation that we're having. It's just in understanding the family, understanding the whole attachment piece, just all of that, and as an advocate, hearing that, understanding that, being validated by what you're saying, lets me know that this isn't anything to do with me. When I've gone into a home and I feel like we're really jiving and grooving together and we've got this good thing going, and then all of a sudden you pull away from me, or you may not answer the phone, you may not answer the door, I can't get you on Zoom, or we, last maybe a hot minute on the Zoom call. It has nothing to do with me. But again, I want to go back to what you said. what happened to you? What happened to you? And to be able to be that person to understand all of this brain development, the whole ACEs thing, what went on in your life in the past, all of that, that this isn't anything to do with me. And when I start thinking it's something to do with me, I start pulling away. I may not be there. It may be there physically, but not emotionally. I pulled out of the game, and because I don't have an understanding of what's going on at all. And that isn't anything to do with me. It's what happened to them. So thank you for that. That is just powerful.
Thank you for saying that, Patrice.
Yeah.
So we have like less than 10 minutes. This conversation has gone so fast. So I wonder if we should just kind of move. I know that we wanted to talk a little bit about some tips and then also help people look at their resources and next steps. Do we want to give them a pause, a time for reflection, or where do we want to go next?
Let's take a pause. We'll continue talking as Liz has said, but we want you to take a pause. And there's just so much information for you to ingest. We feel like it's important for these pauses, and we want you to sit and chat, either think through this on your own, find someone to talk to, or in your team meetings. We want you to really dig deep and go into this, because the conversations of all of us, and then what Mara has given us, and then all of her information that she's got for us to look at really is a lot. But it's a lot for us to really dig into deep, because these are the questions you've been talking about, you've been asking about, you've gone through with Mara, you've gone through with Liz, you've gone through with me and with Kevin. So take your time, talk about it, and come back when you can. We're going to continue on. So thank you.
And I think staying here too for just a second on this attachment piece is important, because we have such prominent racial considerations with this family. The two bio dads are both men of color and different. One, we have one Black male father bio dad, not neither of them are really involved, and then we have Jorge, so Latinx figure, and we have a complete detachment for the kids from their ethnic identities. Mom identifies as a mix of European and has said racist remarks about one of the bio dads. So even if that's not your bio dad, but you know that yours is also a man of color, regardless of that relationship, and you hear mom, who A, is your only biological parent in your home, and B, as a parent is supposed to be that source of safety. You hear mom perpetuate racist ideas, even just about your sibling. That then tells you that as a child of color, as a person of color, you know, for the older ones who maybe are being more cognizant of this, mom's not safe. There's part of me that mom doesn't like, that I can't change. That's me. There's part of me that mom has decided is of lesser value. And I'm stuck with mom in this house, which means mom can't be a safe attachment. Even on mom's best days, mom can't be a safe attachment, because mom's already taught me or my siblings that something about me is wrong and less than, that mom doesn't have, because mom is not a Black woman, is not Hispanic, is not the parts of me that mom doesn't like.
And I would add to that because of that biological dilemma, I need mom to feel safe, because I need her to survive, right? So then I may internalize I'm bad. I may internalize, if I can be less like dad, if I can detach from that part of me, if I can show, if I can overcompensate for the things mom doesn't like about me, then maybe I can get the love and affection that I need. So it really, we often see this because we need to preserve that attachment relationship, we see an internalization of those negative messages and kiddos trying to compensate in ways that then create issues later on, right? So a really important piece, I think. And the struggle, well, I'm wondering if you have anything to add to that, Patrice.
I think you would really learn to hate yourself. And like Liz said, there is no trust. And how can I find beauty in myself? As a female, how can I? When you're not acknowledging that as a Black female, and if as a biracial, say Black female, and I look more like my father, I can't even feel safe. Can you provide safety for me? If you want to detach me from the other half of who I am, how can I feel safe if you don't even want me to identify with my other half? And you're talking badly about my other half. You aren't even my safe person, and I still need you. So I've got this relationship with you that's not even really good. And I find people to validate me as a good person, as a good person of color. It's just a bad situation every kind of way. And then I hate the person that I look like. I just think you leave this child looking for love, looking for validation, and trying to figure out who they are and possibly never figuring out who they are, because you've got on one side of you someone who should validate you as just the person they love and care about no matter what. And then you've got this other person they talk about who's rotten and they've got all this negativity about them, but I'm part of them.
Yeah.
So I just think it's just a hard road to toe. It's just hard trying to figure out who you are and never really having that support or help to do that. And really, when you're in that family, you're biracial and mom is Caucasian, you kind of really never fit in.
Yep.
That's your one side. That's the only side you've got, that you go to family events, that you interact with, but you don't have that other side to really kind of learn how to be that part of you. All those traditions and all of those things that make you who you are culturally, you don't have that. So you're kind of a person who's in, but you don't fit in some ways.
On either group too. And we'll see as these kids get older, we would see, and Mara, I'm sure you can speak to this too, a continuation and almost like a cycle, the repetition of some of these issues in attachment, right? So, okay, as a young kid, mom says my Latinx dad is lazy, he's a typical Mexican. Okay, so I can go one of two ways. I can either, really like push myself away from that, or maybe I recognize what mom said was wrong, that that's a stereotype, that that's mom's bias, that that's her, maybe you have that introspection to do that as you're growing up. But there's still, when it comes to biracial kids and being raised, and I know for me, like I experienced it a lot, is that, you're not this enough, but you're not this enough.
Right.
And you're trying to figure how to attach to both sides of you, how to get more access to the side of you that you feel most pushed away from. And if that can't even start at home, it's exponentially harder. For me, it was, I at least had it at home. It was never, I was not this enough or this enough from either side of my culture. But, out in the world, it's there. And even just making those attachments was hard. So when we're talking about this family who has already had that separation, that pull of that attachment, starting at home, starting at the root of things, we're only going to see it get harder for these kiddos. Even the younger ones who mom may think didn't hear it, will never know it was said, X, Y, and Z.
Constantly trying to justify your existence, your right to exist.
Yeah.
And those are the types of things that we don't, when we think of a list of experiences that are traumatic, those aren't the things that immediately come to mind for a lot of people, right? Especially people who haven't navigated a biracial identity. And that's trauma, right? I mean, as we're talking about growing up in a traumatic environment, even if there wasn't domestic violence and there wasn't these other pieces, growing up in an environment where a part of you is villainized, where a part of you is not accepted by your own parents. And then when you're navigating the rest of the world, that part of you is being demeaned. That's traumatic, right? And we're constantly having to adapt to growing up in that environment. And the adaptations we make are then later on in life going to be difficulties, right? Are going to be issues for us because now I've split myself in some way, right? Yeah. And so I think it's such an important piece of it because often we just talk about it as if it's like an addendum to, or like some other piece to consider without recognizing this is central to people's experience of being a trauma survivor, right? Especially when pieces of our identity are sources of pain, are sources of, feeling not enough, are ways in which we were harmed emotionally or even physically, maybe, then that is a part of the story of this trauma survivor, right? So really important. I wonder as we move forward, just some tips on working with this family. We're gonna spend 2 whole hours on skills, and so we're gonna really dive into that. But just as we're ending today, what do you all think? What are some tips for taking this information and really putting it into action with this family? And I'll say the first thing that comes to mind for me is hard because I'm a little activated, especially after this conversation, by some of what Agnes does. And it's hard for me to access compassion for her. And I recognize that at the end of the day, I'm never going to be those kiddos' primary attachment figure. So no matter how good I am as an advocate, I'm never going to be able to sub in for her. And so I have to figure out how to support her in self-regulating so that she can be open to and trust me enough to hear what it might be like for her kids, right? So it's this really delicate process of building trust with Agnes, helping her feel validated and heard. And then when she's able to feel safe enough, introducing concepts that will help her understand how her words and actions may be impacting her children, right? And so, that for me is, even when it's hard, even when we have a hard time accessing compassion for parents, if we are coming in and saying, well, I work with the kids, right? And that's where I'm going to focus. Yeah, the kids are important, but anything you do, if you want to really impact those kids, if you can help empower Agnes to be a safer attachment figure for those kids, that's going to be exponentially more impactful for them. And that means addressing her own attachment wounding, right? Addressing her own pain, being able to validate, yeah, I understand your ex-partner was really violent with you and that must have been terrifying. And I wonder if that's part of why it's so hard for you to speak kindly about him. That makes sense to me. And I wonder what that's like for your kiddo, right? Because that's still their dad. And I wonder what they're hearing in that. I wonder what they're internalizing in that. So that's what comes to mind for me, first and foremost, with this family, is how am I going to access some compassion so that I can work with parents and understand their context, help them self-regulate so they can show up in a safer, more consistent way for the kids.
I would agree with that totally. So I'll stick with what you say. I think also what you said was important, that it isn't an addendum, we're looking at a whole child. We're looking at whole people, people who've had stuff go on in their lives. And this one thing isn't what makes them who they are. All the things that they've gone through life is what makes them who they are. They're a whole person, and we have to look at them as a whole person. And the things that have gone on in their lives have made them who they are. And they're not doing this to us on purpose to make our lives horrible as family advocates. People go into the homes. And I think the other thing is, and I talk a lot about this to the families when we talk about the circle of security, which is basically what you're talking about, is I think that we need to, as we start addressing these issues and we start looking at what's going on with the people, if we're going to see them as a whole person and really deal with them, we need to take ourselves from here over here to take care of ourselves and bring ourselves back here so we can look at them as a whole picture and as people who are not doing this to us. So we need to, as we say, the parents need to take care of their issues. We need to also step aside and look at ourselves as a whole person and look at what's gone on in our lives and how this is impacting the work that we do and bring ourselves back so we can deal with their issues and help them.
And that's a beautiful teaser for our next conversation, because we're going to be talking about trauma stewardship. So I love that, Patrice. I love what you just said.
So did you then want to close this out and tie up any loose ends that, or say anything more, Liz?
I will say that Mara and Patrice are completely right. And what links both of their train of thoughts is, as an FA, that transparency with yourself. I'd much rather sit across from a peer, whether it be Patrice, whether it be my coach, whoever it needs to be. Of course, Patrice and I hope that it would be, okay, let me take this to my coach. But being honest and being like, I am so emotionally cut off from this person. You'll never believe, what they said. And oh my God, how could they do that to their kid? Because I know even for me, as we were conceptualizing this family and, I was throwing the final touches on our dear Agnes, I was feeling some type of way about Agnes. So sometimes when we start talking about it, and in this series, I'm like, remember, Agnes has her own story and her own purpose, so recognizing that and being honest about it. Yeah, you may feel really bad for feeling that way about one of your families. Maybe it's not something you're proud of, but if you can at least admit it and process through it, there's a way to get back on track of being trauma informed, of remembering these aspects of development, of attachment, and using them as skills, not just something you learned about, but actually applying them as skills. Because at the end of the day, if I cut off from Agnes, I miss being able to recognize, hey, I've been writing down a lot that when I go into my meetings with Agnes and Anthony, Agnes spends a lot of time talking to me about her. That tells me that Agnes is attaching to me. That might mean that maybe, like Patrice, what you're talking about, maybe all of a sudden, well, Patrice and Mara, they're not answering my Zoom calls. What did I do? Right? So if I can at least admit to myself that, then I don't cut off seeing other parts of this larger picture. I could already be thinking of, what am I going to do when Agnes pulls away? Because I'm noticing that she's trying to really hyper attach to me when she does have time with me. We're not being able to talk about kiddo. There's something happening here that could create this situation, X, Y, and Z. And those are things you can start processing about in coaching, in other places of support, and trying to set up protective factors for, rather than dealing with it once it's already destroyed. You're already in a harder place. And Mara is absolutely right that in the next series or in the next episode, we'll really get much deeper into that and kind of what does that look like. So I guess in closing, we really just wanted, to remind everyone that after you watch an episode, you can always reach out to Patrice or myself, or even Mara, as long as we get to hold Mara hostage and keep her with us, and ask for more direct training. You know, Patrice and I can come together to any of the sites, or even individually to any of the sites, and help you guys lead a conversation if you're not sure what pieces you're missing, to go further at the end of each of these episodes, or even the series as a whole.
Yes.
So until next time, this is where we will leave everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you both.